Hi, I'm Stephen Bauman. In this video, I'm going to tell you several things that you can do right now to improve the composition in your portrait drawings. As I told you in my last video, I'm a huge fan of Russian academic drawing. In that video, we focused on how to make a great drawing of a skull. In this one, we're taking on a more complex subject. It's a male portrait. The format of this lesson is going to be really similar to the last one as well, in that I'm going to prepare my drawing, I'm going to submit it to my instructor for feedback, and then I'm going to share with you all the things I was told to improve while implementing those exact changes in my drawing. After having my critique session with Ivan, I came to understand that the composition that I had chosen for this drawing, which in fact was no composition whatsoever because really that was not a part of my priorities when I initially blocked in these 3 drawings, was totally unsavable. It became immediately apparent to me that I was going to need to start from scratch, so totally restarting the drawing on a separate sheet of paper. And this is a lesson that I want to give to you, and I want to tell you exactly how important I think it is. Without a good sense of composition, I don't think a drawing is ever going to reach its full potential. Now let's talk a little bit about why that is. If drawing is a kind of visual communication, a composition then is a narrative. Now I'm quite interested in filmmaking, so I've done a little bit of reading about what plot structures require. The wheel that writers do not tend to try and reinvent is the 3-act structure that almost every play and every movie takes as the essential foundation for the script. For me, I think this is the perfect metaphor for what composition is to drawing, meaning that drawing without a composition is essentially the same as telling somebody a series of random facts in no order whatsoever and expecting them to understand the story. Now, the first most important choice that I can make is where do I position this head on my piece of paper? As a rule, I had almost never strayed from something that I was told very early on as a student. When a model's gaze is facing a dominant direction, be it left or right, the general rule is that you would like to put more space in front of the model's eyes than behind their head. This avoids a model looking like it's backed into a corner or awkwardly arranged on the canvas. Let me just pause that thought really quick and ask you a question. Have you ever heard that saying that you should learn the rules so that you can know when to break them? I'm sure that you have. Every art student on planet Earth has heard that phrase. When we were talking about the composition that I presented for review, I mentioned this blanket principle to Ivan. I said exactly what I told you. I put a little bit more space in front of the model than behind so that he wouldn't be backed into a corner. Ivan confirmed that this was a rule that was also discussed around the Repin Academy, but that in fact, they were far more open to embracing the opposite of that. That in fact, if you ask the question, what happens when you put a model's eye line a lot closer to the edge of the paper? What this can do is create a sense of forward momentum. Of course, you have to take care to balance that on the other side of the page, but when you have a little bit more width to work with, it's perfectly possible. So in my choice for placement, in my second version of this composition, I put the model quite far to the left, much further than I would have had I not considered that I can break this compositional rule in order to create a different and maybe sometimes preferable effect. The way I saw it, I could balance the appreciation of the specific features on the model's head with a very dark yet very soft edged cast shadow that model left on the background. Saying it out loud here, I know it doesn't sound like that big of a deal, but it makes all the difference in the world in terms of how we perceive the story of this portrait. Now, back to what I thought was interesting about this model. When I looked at this lighting situation, it seemed to me that much like in my drawing of a skull, I could create a focus along a 3/4 edge from the temporal line down to the widest point of the chin that would run the viewer's eye across some of the most interesting features that were available in this pose. Now that we're working on a live model in this drawing instead of a skull, it gives us the opportunity to ask some different questions of our subject matter. In particular, looking at this model, or any model for that matter, I want you to ask the question, what is the character of the person you're looking at? Are their features hard and old and chiseled? Or are they soft, fair-skinned and young? The answer to these questions can lead you down a path to finding interesting and purposeful choices about the shape language you use to describe that model. Shape language is a phrase that I've probably not introduced to you in this lesson or any other lesson before. So let me explain exactly what I mean. If we start with a pair of lines, say one that is straight and zigzagging, and another one that is looping around almost infinitely in any direction that it chooses. If we look at those 2 lines and ask ourselves the question, what is the character of each line? What associations do we have to each of these lines? If we look at the straight lines that are joined by hard angle breaks, we're likely to think of geometry, rigidity, and specificity. If we look at the looping line, it's impossible to look at it without thinking of something that is frivolous or silly or fun. Now that we've established that we have different sets of associations to different characters of shape, we have in place the fundamental principle that will allow us to apply shape language to a real subject. So coming back to our model, if we look at this guy, what character of shape do you think we'd like to use to describe his features? Eventually, we can totally leave that up to each individual artist. Some people will see that the fun, flowing, and frivolous shapes could be applied to this model to create a specific kind of commentary. For me, I looked at his features and they spoke to me of hardness and crispness and rigidity. So I wanted to make a drawing that reflected this idea and this very particular aesthetic. But just remember, anytime you look at your subject, there is an infinite range of expressions in the shape language that you use. Here, for the purposes of this lesson, I've pointed out just two relatively opposing shape language concepts. In reality, you can choose those two or anything in between. Now, the next thing that I'm going to tell you totally messed me up. In fact, I was taking notes during my meeting with Ivan, and when he said this, I wrote it down and wrote 3 exclamation points next to it. He told me that the advice was given in general when you find a very long cast shadow that you should simply shrink it. While that might not sound controversial to you, it totally flies in the face of almost everything I'd been taught at the Academy. Our view at the time was that fidelity to the model and to the lighting situation was of paramount concern. Here, I was being told something totally different. To change a cast shadow, the length of a cast shadow, requires that you essentially lie about the position of the light in relationship to the model. So was he willing to break that rule uniformly across the board to change everything about the lighting situation? Well, yeah, and he didn't think it was that big a deal. So if you look at the source image for this drawing, and you look at the drawing that I eventually made, I've not only shrunk the cast shadow, I've totally removed parts of it, meaning that I had to essentially make up the things that were in the positions where the cast shadow was as if they were in light. Before we go any further, let me say, this is not easy to do. However, once you understand a little bit about the dynamics of light and how form shadows and cast shadows work, it's also not the hardest thing in the world to do. But I can make one absolute assurance. If you never experiment with it, you'll never get good at it. So let me draw a line in the sand and say, from this point onward, we're going to be asking ourselves the question, do I want this cast shadow or do I not? That's the level of autonomy that you have as the director of this movie. You choose whether the scene stays in or gets cut. Another thing that I've always loved so much about Russian academic drawings can also be explained through their ideas on composition and its uses. The utter simplicity and total impunity with which they will wipe out entire passages of a drawing, be it in shadow or in light, was always so impressive, and it spoke to me of someone that was taking choices in a really purposeful way. What that purpose was at the time, I had literally no idea. Of course, now I come to understand that they're drawing attention to one thing and away from another. And you could see this in the simplicity or the flatness of the value with which they would draw a particular area. If you look at this drawing in specific, I want you to take a look at where the neck meets the ear. This is just underneath the shaggy hairline on the far right-hand side. If you look inside my drawing and you look inside the source image, you're going to find 2 totally different levels of information. Inside the source image, it's possible to see that there's an ear, that there's a neck, that there's stuff happening there. And if you look inside my drawing, there's literally nothing happening there. By washing all of that away, what I did was push the depth forward at the 3/4 edge of the head. This works very much like a depth of field focus in photography. If your depth of field is focused on the tip of the model's nose, those passages further away from the camera lens are going to appear in a far softer focus. Now this is a depth language that we understand very intuitively. And so, why would we not use some version of it to enhance the sense of composition and focus in our drawing? Now, while a camera might render this as a sharp versus a foggy focus, we can do the same thing with levels of information. And this is what I want to point out here. You can simply leave things out of a drawing. Now, ideally, you're not going to leave out significant structural features. But again, if it's a matter of making a good composition versus showing something that happens to be there, I think I'm always going to choose the making a better composition version. In this instance, you need to ask yourself the question, does this merit inclusion in the drawing? And since you, and only you, knows the coolest part of the subject and what you want to emphasize, only you can really answer that question. For me, the information that was taking place in the shadow there did not merit inclusion because it would have competed from a depth perspective with the features I wanted to show because I thought they were the coolest. Bringing this back to the beginning of the point I was making, what was this feature that I admired in these Russian drawings? In essence, it was their ability to understand how much to simplify something based on its location in relationship to the focal point. That focal point then becomes like the North Star that guides all of the other compositional choices that you need to take. That brings us to the end of this lesson. I want to say thank you so much for spending a little bit of time on my YouTube channel. This lesson, like all the other ones on my YouTube channel, have full extended versions that are available on my Patreon page. That's patreon.com/StephenBaumanArtwork. If you haven't signed up yet, you can follow the link in the description of this video and it will take you right there. If you like the content here, you can like this video and subscribe to the channel so you get notified when I put out new lessons. Thank you again. I'm Stephen Bauman and I'll see you in the next video.